You need the half sheet you received in class today. First, we will complete the middle section, which shows different ways to represent the same information. So by middle section, I mean the big box area of your notes. Then we will cover the synonyms for both the X and the Y. So that's when we're going to fill in the left side of the page and the right side of the page. Synonyms are words that mean the same thing. So these are other ways that we're going to start talking about the variable X and the variable Y. You need to know these. So you need to get familiar with these terms, understand that they're interchangeable, and be prepared to use all the terms. So this should look like the page that you received in class today. As I said, we're going to fill out the middle section first. So I'm going to go ahead and make up an equation as an example. So y equals 2x plus 1. And you'll see below it, it says f of x equals something. F of x is just a fancy way of saying y. So if y equals 2x plus 1, f of x also equals 2x plus 1. The bottom left, we have a vertical table, and that's what we've been using really often. So we're going to go ahead and fill that out first. And I'm going to actually start my x values at -2 this time, rather than 0. And we know that we have a constant value of 1. So at 0, we know we're going to have 1. But we could always plug 0 into the equation. 2 times 0 is 0 plus 1 is 1. We're going to do the same thing for everything else. -2 times 2 is -4, plus 1 is -3. -1 times 2 is -2, plus 1 is -1. And so we can fill in 2 times 1 is 2, plus 1 is 3, and 2 times 2 is 4, plus 1 is 5. Remember, a fancy way of saying y, and it's called function notation, is f of x. If you want to make a little note above the y value that that's f of x, go right ahead. It means the same thing. We're going to go next to our our horizontal table from our vertical table. So we're just going to transfer all of this information. Instead of our x values getting larger as we go down the column, they're going to get larger now as we move to the right. And the same thing with the y values. We put the corresponding y values in just underneath the x values. And then we can go ahead and graph that information. Remember, these are multiple representations, so we are just showing the same information a variety of ways. The last thing we're going to do, well, not the last thing, we're going to add in our x and y coordinates. And this is something we haven't practiced a lot, but you have seen it in class and you're going to see it more often. That's all I can fit in mine right now, so I'm going to stop, but it continues until we put all of those values in. The last representation that we're going to add, which is completely brand new, is called a mapping. And that's where you see these ovals over to the left-hand side in the center of the box. The left oval is going to represent our x values, and our right oval represents our y values. And basically, we're just transferring the information from our tables or from our graph into the ovals, and that's going to create a mapping once we're finished. So it's important that you always put the values in numerical order from least to greatest, and we do that for the x's as well as for the y's. And in this case, it matches up perfectly. Sometimes it mixes up a little bit. So once we have our x values in and our y values in, we're going to draw arrows from the x value that corresponds to the y value. So that means whatever x value I put into the equation, my arrow points to the y value that will come out. And that completes our mapping. And it's important that you put arrows at the edge so we know that that's where it's going. So now we're going to move into our synonyms for our x and our y variables. You guys already know that the x can also be called the independent variable. Okay, and the counterpart to the independent for our y is going to be the dependent, and I know you're familiar with that as well. A new word, and we haven't thrown this around this year, and maybe you have heard of it in the past, the x is also referred to as the domain. So all the x values are your domain values. All of your y's are called your range values. And I'm going to start using those terms more often, especially later this week and next week when we're talking about the domain and range of different functions. Our x values are also often called the input, which means that's what we put into the equation. And then the counterpart to that would be the output, or what comes out of the equation. Okay? And that's what these arrows indicate. X goes in, Y comes out. One of the other things that I often call, that I've been calling it, is the cause. And that gives us Y as the effect. But another way to put it is called an if statement. If this happens, then this occurs also. So if you need to pause this for just a couple of seconds so that you can make sure you get all this information down, that's great. If you want to add something at all to the y, you might want to just go ahead and put the f of x above the y, so to remind yourself that those mean the same thing. And that's because it's telling us that it's a function of x. Because x happens, y happens. And we'll talk about that. It's called function notation, and we'll be getting into that in coming weeks as well. So if any of this seems confusing and we kind of went through it quickly, just understand the purpose is to give you a reference page and to help you become familiar with some terms that you're going to start hearing pretty regularly. There's a couple of pieces we're going to add to this later, but for right now, this is all you need. So be sure to bring your notes and your composition book to class and be ready to start using these terms.